I'll start off with saying that data and artificial intelligence is really accelerating the pace of the business and economic disruptions that you see in this era of fourth industrial revolution, right? And what COVID-19 has done, as I mentioned just now, is actually brought upon us forward and also forced upon us a new normal way ahead of time, right? So this morning, I'll be happy to share my thoughts on the need for all of us to urgently accelerate our digital transformation to enable organizations to deal with the unknown post-COVID era. But before I do that, I just like to step back a bit from technology and look at actually what's happening in the real world, what's happening in the business world, right? So if you look at this Digital Economy Report 2019, which was published by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, there was a lot of interesting contents in this report, but the one which kind of caught my eye was this figure, I.17, where it shows, it provides a bubble chart of companies, digital companies all around the world and how they're grouped, right? Now, this is quite old data, as you can see that, the market capitalization of this company, which is the size of these bubbles, actually quite old data. Today, I think, Apple is almost a $2 trillion company, and many of these companies are already, more than $1 trillion, right? So, but still, I think the fact still remains. There's a couple of things which caught my eye when I look at this diagram. I think the first thing is that if you look at these companies out here, only a handful of it actually existed before 1995. Possibly, I think Microsoft, probably Apple, maybe SAP, and maybe Samsung are the only kind of companies that existed prior to 1995. So, and if you look at many of these companies, I would argue that you probably don't even recognize many of this. I'm sure a lot of you have not heard of Tencent. Sorry, NF, for example, which is the most successful fintech company that we have today. Yeah. So a lot of these companies really came from nowhere to become very successful companies in a very short period of time, right? Just to show an example, companies like Uber became a $40 billion company in just about 5 years. And in comparison, Microsoft took 15 years to become just a $1 billion company, right? The other thing that I think it's worth noting that if you look at these companies, they're not all like robotics or industry-based companies. They're cross industries, right? Obviously, Microsoft, Apple, and maybe SAP, we are kind of computing technology companies, right? That's pretty straightforward. But what is Amazon? What is Alibaba? What's Tencent? They are actually retail or B2B or B2C companies, right? Facebook and Alphabet, they are advertising companies. Uber, Grab, they are transportation companies, right? And not only that, it is a combination of different kinds of industry that is disrupting the economics today, but also the fact that we don't know where our competition is coming from. So, for example, at Microsoft, we wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago that our major competitors today is not the Oracles or the IBMs of the world, but it is Amazon, for example, and Google, which are retail companies and advertising companies, right? So this is the kind of the characteristics of this new world, right? So if we move on and try to understand what are the major changes, what are the major disruptions which are happening, which is driven by these underlying technologies that we see today, I think there are two main things, right? The first is that these technologies, which is driving the fourth industrial revolution, has given consumers, citizens like us, a lot more power, a lot more access to information, right? So if you think about it today, if you want to buy something, what would you do? You would actually go to the website, do all the research that you have, and by the time that you decide to buy something, I mean, you probably know by 60 or 70% sure on what you want to buy. And this changes the way in which companies need to, reach out to their customers. They need to engage them earlier rather than later, right? So the dynamics of buying and selling has changed quite significantly. But the good thing, the same set of technologies has also enabled, companies to also leverage on the same technology. And what is resulted is that now you don't have to be a big company to really have massive impact, right? I talked about it in the previous slide, whereby many companies, which are multi-billion-dollar companies today, really did not exist before 1995. They came from nowhere, disrupting traditional industries. But what is the thing about small companies which make them really, advantageous is actually the agility. So essentially in today's world, companies, organizations need to be agile to be able to ensure that they, remain relevant and be able to compete in this new world. So what is this underlying technology, so to speak? Prof. Ibrahim just talks about, in 1920s and the kind of technologies and, robotics. He mentioned about robotics, but what's really driving? Now, if you look at the first industrial revolution, it's about the steam technologies and how that changed the way people do manufacturing, from cottage industries to to mechanized industries. How transportation changed from being sail ships to steam power ships, and land transportation changed from horse riding to steam powered engines, for example. So what's really driving this fourth industrial revolution? And Alice talks about this thing called a digital platform. So what's a digital platform? So a lot of people say, oh, this is just computers and making everything is driven by computers. It's kind of not wrong, but I think it's a bit more than that. It turns out when you talk about digital platforms, it's a mashup of technologies, right? And that's why I would argue today, when people just talk about Internet of Things or just about big data or just about cloud or just about AI, I think they're missing the point. It tends to be this combination or this mashup of technologies where social and mobile in the early days generate huge amount of human generated content, right? Then with Internet of Things, that really exploded the amount of data, because now you have sensors being generating data and storing it in the internet. Now when you have to deal with huge amounts of data, we're talking about terabytes per day or terabytes per hour, for example. You cannot use traditional ways of processing this data, and that's why big data techniques like using Hadoop and and data lakes and so on became a new kind of storage and data processing technology. But all of this was not possible if it is not because of what we call the hyperscale commercial cloud, or cloud in short, which has reduced the cost of computing by an order of magnitude. So essentially, if you were trying to build your own data centers and put your own servers, that's essentially 10 times more expensive than trying to leverage on this, cloud, hyperscale cloud, that you can do pay-per-use, you can use it when you need it, you shut it down when you don't, and so on and so forth, right? And because of these clouds run at millions of servers, it leverages on that economies of scale, essentially, right? And all of this now in recent days have enabled and really progressed the use of artificial intelligence in the real world. And I will not talk much about that because I'll be addressing that in the future slides. Now, a couple of things to note that, these technologies, becomes disruptive when they're used together, essentially. And I'll give you an example right after this, right? The second point I'd like to make here is that a lot of people say, again, I mentioned just now in my my panel session, saying that technology is moving too fast, right? But if you look at the underlying technologies here, most of these technologies existed a long time ago, right? What's your mobile phone? It's just a computer, right? But what's the difference? Why is it now that it's become disruptive? It's because these technologies have been democratized. Essentially, if you think about your smartphone, and Prof. Ibrahim mentioned just now how about bringing men to the moon in April 11. They have computers at that point of time, but these computers are just 1/3 of the power of the computers in your pocket, which is your smartphone, right? But the cost of the computers at that time was, I'm sure, billions of dollars compared to the few $100 smartphone that you have in your handbags and in your pockets today. But not only that, the fact that now, I mean, if you wanted to use a computer at that point of time during Apollo 11, you need to be a rocket scientist to be able to deal with it. But today, a 2 year old can probably use the smartphone better than I can, for example. So it is about the democratization of technology. It's not really about the technology itself. The use of technology has changed because of the fact it's become easier to use and more accessible to everyone. Now, the third point I would like to make before I leave this slide is that all of this is internet enabled. This internet glues all these things together. The moment you don't have the internet, it loses its, a disruptive nature or it's the power of it. So just for example, you take your mobile phone and you switch off your LTE, your 4G, and switch off your Wi-Fi, what does that smartphone become? Almost useless, right? So that is the reason why the internet is very key. It's all of these technologies are actually internet enabled. Just to demonstrate, how this combination of technologies is used, I always like to use how, Grab or Uber uses this, right? So if you think about Grab or Uber, both, the drivers and passengers use their mobile phones. They would have, sensors like, accelerometer, like your, GPS, for example, even cameras that they leverage on in terms of, doing a couple of things. And all this data is actually collected by Grab. And when a customer actually requests for a ride, you can see that you can then calculate where's the closest car, how long it takes to travel, how far, calculate the tariffs for that particular ride, and then offers that particular ride to the customer and see the customer accepts it or otherwise. So if you look at this, it is this combination of, it is the digital platform which consists of this combination of technologies glued together by the internet. So it involves your mobile phone, it involves Internet of Things, which is essentially the sensors in your phones. They leverage on, social in terms of exchanging information about the drivers, about the passengers, and so on. They have to process terabytes of data per hour, and hence, they're using big data techniques. And companies like this wouldn't have exist if they did not have access to this low-cost, powerful cloud computing infrastructure, that has enabled them to store and process huge amounts of data. And now they're leveraging artificial intelligence to bring automation and making decisions in a split second. And more about this in the next slide. Now, if you're interested to see the business models of this kind of digital companies like Uber, like Google, and so on, I would recommend you to look at this book called named Platform Revolution by a group of people from MIT. And if you look at in this book, it talks about this, how, in these digital companies, they leverage on this network effects of a two-sided market, right? How can you create, as you create more drivers available, you create more demand, and you do this in a way that it creates this, continuous vicious cycle to increase the market. The more drivers, more demand, more drivers, right? And the way they do this is they monitor a couple of things. Because the more drivers you have more geo coverage, then less downtimes of drivers, which lowers down the fare, and then have faster pickups and so on. And that creates more demand. And then it then demands more drivers, for example, right? So that is what we call the positive feedback loop that they monitor all the time. But they also have the more negative feedback. For example, if there's too many drivers and not enough demand, then you have a situation that your fare becomes too low, then the drivers actually drop off, and then suddenly, you don't have enough drivers to service the customers itself. So this balance, this very, delicate balance need to be monitored and responded in real time. And this is where, data and AI is really very important, because these decisions are all made based on real-time data, which is coming in, and also artificial intelligence to make automated decisions, right? You can't have people making decisions with, an hour-a-day report or a monthly report, right? It's near real-time decision making, right? So that is why, this kind of business models wouldn't have existed if they do not really fully leverage on technology like data and AI. But whilst this enables you to engage customers and transform products, we don't see in the back end side how this company also leverage on the digital technologies or AI-enabled digital technologies to optimize the operation. They can't do this if their operational cost becomes too high, right? And they also have to leverage on the employees they have. And it also enables these employees to be very productive in their environment. So that is why if you look at a lot of organizations which is undergoing digital transformation or digitizing, these are essentially the four pillars to look at, and how you engage your customers in the, your ever-changing customers, how you transform your products even in near real time, how you optimize your operations, and how you empower your employees. So now we've talked about these digital new companies. What happens to the old companies like Microsoft, like Apple, and so on, right? Does that mean that we have to fall over and die, right? I think it goes back to the fact that, we need to be operating like a startup, like these digital companies, be very agile, right? And if you don't do this, it's actually quite catastrophic. Now, this is a company which all of us know, right? And if I were to have a face-to-face session on this, I'll ask which company is this? And it turns out this company, when Apple was launched their first iPhone in 2017, they were quite a successful company, and they will remain to be successful in the next 3 years until 2010. Suddenly, they kind of became irrelevant just in a short period of 5 months, right? And this company is not Nokia; it is actually BlackBerry, right? I'm sure most of us don't use BlackBerry today, right? I know only one or two people who does that, right? Excuse me. But what should this company have done? I think what they didn't do well, in my opinion, was they did not create that startup mindset to create the next S curves, right? So that they can then continue to be relevant, as things change, as customers change, as the market change. I think they were not good at doing that, right? And that is why in today's world, you need to future-proof business. So all organizations need to think about, yes, we need to run the business that we have. For example, it's Microsoft, then we have all our, software business and so on. We need to use the best practices to run a matured business the way we know, right? Which is typically like the way, we do when we go through an MBA program and so on and so forth. But while that's still necessary, it's not enough. All companies need to also have an arm which takes risks, right? Which creates, innovation. They might try 10 crazy things and maybe 2 will be successful, right? And because we talk about that powerful technologies today is democratized, you can do this without hefty upfront investments, right? If it works, you expand the use of the infrastructure, digital infrastructure. It doesn't matter, you just shut it down, and probably you just spend maybe 1,000 ringgit, for example, right? So that allows many companies, many forward-looking companies. If you look at what they're doing, they have this arm which they say, "I'll create this small team, go and do what you think it's best to create markets or defend against the market, leverage on digital technologies, and see whether it's going to fly or not. If it doesn't fly, let's shut it down. If it does, you expand it." So failure is an option, but learning from the failures is also important. And as these new businesses grow and creating that next S curve, that's when you move it into mature phase where you run it like a normal company. So companies today need to have this dual personality, right? A matured phase where they run their existing business, and a startup kind of facet which actually they drive innovations and new kinds of businesses. Just to show an example, I had an opportunity to host a fireside chat with the country manager for Grab about a year and a half ago. And which he essentially says that if it's not because of digital technologies, his business will essentially doesn't exist. He can't run the business, the Grab business, without data, artificial intelligence enabled by these digital platforms, right? Now, if you look at in April 2019, when I actually was having this fireside chat, they had only 4 services, right? Now, 3 months later, I looked at the Grab interface. They had 3 additional services, right? They've now not only gone into fintech, they've gone into delivery of, into things like hospitality, like hotels, right? They have even prepaid. They have, a trip planner, for example, and that's travels, right? They continue to expand their traveling, so they will add new kinds of services, right? Which maybe at that point in time doesn't make sense, but as time goes on, you'll see that it played an important role. In May 2020, they have another, I think, additional three more services, and I'm not sure what's the latest. You can check the Grab interface yourself, right? But you see that how these companies don't sit on their laurels. They actually, constantly innovate, right? And if you think about Grab, they were successful in this, ride-hailing business, which is that matured side of the cycle. But if they didn't invest in the food delivery, they would probably be, which would have been a problem to them during this COVID-19. It's because of the fact that they already had these food delivery services that has enabled them to continue to be successful and relevant during the COVID-19 time. And these kind of companies will continue to reinvent themselves quite rapidly. Now let's kind of switch gears a bit and talk about artificial intelligence, right? So my first job was a lecturer, so I always like to go back to, the definitions and what AI is, and then expand from there. So if you look at what AI is defined, I like to use the Alan Turing.net definition, which is really the science of making computers do things which it was done by human beings requires intelligence, right? And what is intelligence? Intelligence things like reasoning, yeah, understanding, interacting, right? Perception, for example, problem solving, and so on, right? So is what intelligence is. Now, let me ask, why is it now that AI has become important, given that all of us know, and I think it was also mentioned by Prof. Ibrahim talked about Alan Turing, right? One of the earlier researchers in the area of artificial. He died in 1950. So AI existed a long time ago, actually, right? It's not something new, but why is it now that it's been disrupted? Now, if you look at AI in the early stages, it's kind of, it's kind of about expert systems where people had to develop programs, with lots of if-else statements, a decision tree essentially to represent the capabilities of the human person. So I think if people who live long enough, like me, in the early days, we have, I think it's called mycin, where we try to develop something what Google Doctor has done now, which is trying to predict what, based on the characteristics of the problems that you have, decide what the problem of the person is, right, from a medical perspective. So the way that they did it was to program it, and we needed an expert to be able to extract the knowledge from these experts to do it. The problem there is that most experts will not be open to sharing this knowledge, because for them it's just like, hey, you're going to take over my job. Why should I be sharing all my expertise, right? But the breakthrough came when machine learning became viable. And machine learning, rather than using a program to develop the predictive capabilities of computers, it actually uses data. Essentially you program using data. That's the simplest way for me to describe this, right? And you can do that because now you have computers which became a lot more cheaper and more powerful to be able to do that. I think even the concept, and then concept of perceptrons was way back in 1960s, I believe, right? Which was done, very quite early, but it couldn't be implemented in a useful way. It couldn't even do an XOR function, right? Using this early perceptrons, because of the fact that we didn't have enough computing power. But as cloud, right, cloud computing reduced the cost of powerful computation and reduce the cost of storage significantly, and the availability of data in that, the description of this digital platform, what has happened, we can have more deeper neural networks and so on, which does amazing things and amazing breakthroughs that we've seen in the last couple of years. And to share that, if you look at AI, a lot of the significant breakthroughs, and as explained just now, the way we measure the success of, one way to measure the success of any AI is that you measure it against the human beings. So if you don't know whether it's a human being or a person which which is doing something, then that's where you say, okay, AI has reached a certain level of success, right? So in the last, just Microsoft itself, in the last 3 4 years, we've kind of broke through what's known as this human parity in a couple of areas. In 2016, we exceeded human parity test in the area of vision, right, using a 152-layer ResNet, deep neural network configuration. 2017, we actually managed to exceed human parity on speech recognition, right, using LSTM, a combination of LSTM and recurrent neural networks and other things, right? 2018, we had two breakthroughs. One is uh, reading comprehension. We exceeded human parity in that area. And also in 2018, we exceeded human parity in terms of translation. I think in this case from English to simplified Chinese, I believe. Yeah. Sorry, translation and speech synthesis in 2018. Oh, three things in 2018, right? And finally, in 2019, very recently, we talked about language understanding, right? So that is something that we had exceeded in 2019 itself. And if you look at all this, it can be used in many areas. In fact, today, I think I'm sure, for those of you who have, an Amazon Echo, for example, at home, you're talking to this Amazon thing, quite a pretty natural way, for example, right? I wanted to demonstrate speech recognition human parity. So if you give me just a minute, I need to kind of log in again, unshare my slides and put it back because I forgot to turn on the sound. Yeah, just a minute. Yeah. Slides. Okay, so I'm back on. Hopefully this will work. So if you look at speech recognition human parity, there was a lot of activities in this area since 1993. But in 2016, as I mentioned, we managed to, humans were having accuracy of 5.9%. We exceeded that in 2016. So if it was a real live presentation, I would actually ask people to listen to this. So I will repeat that again. So listen carefully, yeah? So I hope you heard that, right? So what did the person say, right? So A, B, or C, right? So in a kind of a live face-to-face session, I typically get about 60% accuracy, right? And the answer here is actually C, right? It's actually C. Now, you kind of can guess, but it's not easy for even humans to be able to understand what was said, but yet, machines can actually do a pretty good job in, you know, um, speech recognition. In the area of speech synthesis is also very interesting. I think in the past, there's a lot of traditional architectures we use. You use linguistic data model, acoustic data model, and so on. Now we've moved towards more of a very neural network based, in terms of neural acoustic generator and also a neural vocoder. So there's new architectures to do this, leveraging on deep neural networks, right? So that has really resulted in some very significant breakthroughs. So if you listen to this two sentences, the aim here is to decide which of them is human, which is machine, right? So if you listen to this.
As the name suggests, the original submarines came from Yugoslavia. This is easy enough if you have an unfinished attic directly above the bathroom.
So then I will normally ask, say, okay, which one is human and which one is machine? I normally get a pretty good response, probably 70% correct. But still, if you think about this, it's very hard for you to distinguish between humans and machine in this speech synthesis application, right? So the answer is actually the first one is actually done by machine, really. Then if you look at language understanding, which was just last year, which we reached human parity, if you look at this English sentence, the city council refused the demonstrators a permit because they advocate license. So the question is, the word they refers to what? The city council or the demonstrators? For a human being, is quite straightforward, right? This is obviously relates to demonstrators, right? For these very simple sentences. But just imagine if I change the word advocate to, it's in this case, it's demonstrators. But if I change it to fear, what does they refer to? It is obvious that they now refer to the city council. So that's kind of the complexity of, language understanding. Now, this is a very simple language. You can imagine there are a lot of other sentences where this kind of understanding is actually not pretty straightforward. And this is the kind of breakthroughs that we see today. And all these breakthroughs have real applications, right? Out there, people are using bot services. People are using a real-time translation. Probably Brian talks about how we can. I think Prof. Kamil used to talk about real-time translation using Google Translate and so on and so forth. So there are real applications which is impacting, which is available today. Now, I just like to switch. If you look at an application like this, right? This application, if you bought about myself, you can try it out yourself. Go to howold.net, take a photo of someone, you then, or then what this app does is to predict your age, and obviously, it's looking at my photo there. It says I'm 40 years old. It looks pretty accurate, right? And by the way, the lady by the side is actually my daughter, not my wife. Yeah. So I asked, some a data scientists and an AI expert, say, how long will it take to come up with something like this, right? So the estimation is about, I think, five people, computer scientists, perhaps an IT person, a mathematician, domain experts and stuff like that. 18 months to be able to do something which can be rolled up from a commercial perspective, right? So that's about 100 man months, essentially, right? But this application was done by one person in around about 3 weeks. And after that 3 weeks, he got 50 million users in 7 days. You can imagine the scale of what he had to do when he deployed this system, right? And at peak is about 1.2 million users per hour. So this is the kind of productivity that today's tool actually provide, leveraging on these digital platforms. And this has real applications. For example, you can come up with a very targeted advertisement for someone who just walks by, and you have a camera pointed out at this person. And say, for example, someone like me, very old, I might just push things like maybe a walking cane, for example, and so on and so forth, right? Well, if it's younger, then I might put something else, maybe a smart handphone or a PC or whatever it is, right? So it has real applications. Now, this is where, for example, companies like Pepsi, they had a problem where in the past, what they had to do to stock up, their drinks in shops, they had to actually send people down to the shops, count the number of bottles there, and then, decide how much supply they should be providing, right? They can use a bit of predictive analytics and so on, but still, in many cases, they had to send someone down to the ground to do this, and it's very expensive, very time consuming, and so on. So what they did is they leveraged tools that you are available today, and what they just had to do is, I think, about two people that took the program to use the tools, which is all cloud based, by the way, right? They then marked the bottles in squares and then labeled them as what type of drinks they are, and they did it for all the photos they had, maybe thousands and thousands of photos. Took I think about 2 or 3 weeks to do this. And once that's done, they train the system and they get some percentage of accuracy. In this case, they reach 92%. They were happy with it. And then they create the app just by, clicking that particular create app button down there, right? Uh, so they just create this, they click this button, and you see that an app is created which runs both on the PC as well as the mobile phone. And this app can be downloaded to all the shops that they were servicing, so that they can actually now just take a photo to determine, how much supply to provide to this particular shop. So the point I'm making here is no longer, it's no longer expensive to roll out an AI-based application in today's world. There are tools out there that allows you to do it, right? Not for all AI applications, but certainly for a large number of AI workloads that maybe even shops or small companies can actually leverage on. But the thing is, it's not about just buying the technology, or the technology has been democratized. It's cheap enough for everyone to be able to use it. But I think the reason why it is still a challenge for many organizations is because for us to leverage on artificial intelligence, it requires data, right? And it requires a change in mindset in what kinds of infrastructure to use in terms of deployment. You're still using the old ways, like buying your own servers, building your own data centers. You won't be able to do things very very quickly, right? So this so I think initially the biggest challenge for many organizations is this, what I term as cultural and mindset change, because they need to have a data culture. They need to be able to be open to leverage on digital technologies and not the old ways of doing this, right? Once they are able and they have enough data, then they can leverage on tools that what I've shown you just now to really start using AI in maybe simpler kinds of workloads. And as they become good at this, and as they create more data, then they can go into the more you know um, powerful use of AI. Where they need more fundamentals and R&D and custom AI using VGG16 or ResNet or whatever it is to have more powerful solutions out there, right? So it's not kind of you can just buy this, but it's actually a journey for many organizations, especially starting with a cultural and mindset change. And I think all organizations have to start somewhere, and I think they have to start with this initial change, having the mindset that they want to transform before they can actually embark on this journey of fully leveraging on AI-enabled digital platforms. And this is why I think from our point of view, we feel that there are basically two things organizations need to do. One is really embrace AI-enabled digital technologies, because that has been democratized. There's no reason why you shouldn't be using it. But also secondly is to enable that your employees, the organization's employees, to learn about this in part of their learning culture, to be able to have the skills to be able to leverage on these powerful technologies. And this is the two key things which needs to happen in a lot of organizations, which wants to be successful and remain relevant in this new world. And as mentioned just now by Prof. Ibrahim, there's a lot of applications where I talk about. He mentioned about autonomous vehicles. He mentioned about healthcare, but even in education, if you already moved from an old way of doing things, paper-based, to now to be electronic-based, that if you store all this data, that gives you a lot more insights and a lot more ability to do things like predictive analytics and so on in the area of agriculture. And I think, and that is why essentially most nations around the world is really, making AI really an important agenda for themselves, because they see the significant economic impact. So the question is, where are we in all this, right? So in 2018, a bit old, but I think we probably improve a bit now. But we did a kind of a survey. We commissioned IDC to do a survey on where we are from this, being this high tech intensity organizations in the country. So we actually covered 15 geographies in this part of the world, and Malaysia is one of them, where for every country we have 100 kind of organizations that we engage with, and we interviewed 100 leaders as well as 100 workers across different kinds of vertical industries and sizes of organizations and so on. The way IDC did the study, they took kind of 6 dimensions, in the questionnaires, from a data strategy, investments, culture, capabilities, and infrastructure. And so obviously, if you were to cover all of Asia Pacific, then you will see that it's kind of an average in the middle, right? So the question is, where is Malaysia out of this? Unfortunately, we're a bit behind, right? And the major areas where we're really behind is, one is having this data culture. We don't have a culture where we respect and we really actually leverage on data. Data is in silos. We don't want to share data, right? Even within the organizations, and we don't have this data first mindset. The other area is actually investment, but to be specific, it's not investment in technology, it's investment in digital technologies, right? That's which I described earlier on. So we might buy technologies a lot, we spend a lot on technology, but we are using the older technology. So it's a bit like, in today's world, where we're using cars, we still use, what we do is we buy bicycles, for example, right? So these are the two major, I think, areas of improvements for Malaysian organizations. And the main reason for this is leadership. And I can share that with you that even at Microsoft, when we had the previous leaders, despite having all the technologies and capabilities, we did not transform because the leader decided, no, we want to still leverage on the existing business, and why should we change, right? It's only when we change the leadership change that he was brave enough to drive a lot of the transformation that we see. So it requires courage, actually, right? Leaders need to take the risk to be able to try out these new opportunities, try out new things, and fail fast, or you succeed, in a very big way, essentially, right? And the result of the leaders not buying into digital transformation, they didn't invest in the right skills, neither did they invest in the right set of technologies. And that's why I see that there's a bit of, challenge, especially for organizations today. I hope it's better now. It's 2 years down the road, but we'll see. But the point is also that those who undergo this digital transformation, who actually embrace digital transformation, they did see benefits. In fact, most organizations tend to use digital transformation more in the area of productivity and also efficiency. Even in that area, you see like 1.6 times. So we're talking about these two charts here, right? 1.6 times to 1.8 times in terms of improvements. But I think the biggest improvement are those who really embraced it because of wanting to be competitive in this new world, and also to drive innovation, where they see, 2.3 times, innovation enhancements and higher competitiveness when they embrace digital transformation. Yeah. So, as also mentioned just now, with power comes responsibility. And if you like to look into the challenges in AI, I would recommend to read this book, Weapons of Mass Destruction. And I think it's not being anti-AI, but really for us to understand what are the implications, right? Now, if you use humans, for example, to evaluate a loan or to evaluate insurance, right? If you're a bad evaluator, you might make maybe 50% accuracy, but you are only servicing maybe 20 people a day. So 10 people a day who is being, wrongly evaluated is not good, but certainly not catastrophic. But if you use AI to make the decisions, and AI is not designed properly, it's biased, for example. It looks at your face and I don't like your face, and hence, doesn't give you the loan, then the impact could be big, because if it's accuracy and it's biased, and it processes maybe 20,000 applicants a day, then you're thinking about thousands and thousands of people being impacted. And that's the reason why we have to be careful in applying this kind of powerful technologies, right? And this is also the reason why nations, as well as organizations like Microsoft, we have to have a principled approach in using these powerful technologies. And for Microsoft, we have these 6 principles. The first is fairness. That means the AI system we develop should treat people fairly, right? So, example, in loan application, it should treat the people with similar applications, similar, in a very similar way. It cannot make decisions based on the fact that I don't like your face, for example, right? The second is reliability and safety. And as in any systems, when you design, if something goes wrong, you always want to fall back to a very safe environment, right? So you don't want to have a situation when something goes wrong, or it makes a very wrong decision, or maybe the system dies, it does something which is bad, for example. So reliability and safety is also of paramount importance. The third is actually privacy and security. As you know, that because digital platforms are connected to the internet, right? But the internet brings risks. And as a result of that, you also must make sure that your data remains private. You protect privacy of your data, because sometimes you have to deal with quite sensitive information. And you must make sure that you put all the securities in place, the modern securities in place, to address the challenges, the very, I would say, challenging, the threat environment that we have today. The fourth area is inclusiveness. It means that, for the targets that you want to have, then you must make sure that all of them are treated in a way it engages this all this broad, so that no parties involved are affected. So, for example, if you were to develop an AI system, let's say in healthcare, and you use the Malaysian data to do this. When you move this to another country, it may not be the same because we never did test it in another country, and there could be differences that you're not aware of. So you have to do transfer learning and making sure that those people who are not covered in your initial training to be covered. Yeah. Now, the fourth area is cuts across is transparency. And the reason why this is important is that if something goes wrong, you can actually look at why it went wrong in the first place, which is very important because you can't have, and this is not easy, right? To understand why did the AI make that decision? Because most of it, when you do AI, you just look at accuracy at the end of the day, right? And finally, accountability. All of us, if you are involved in any AI project, you have to be accountable. It's not a machine we just accountable because you actually build, you actually train the machine. So in conclusion, whether we like it or not, AI, you know, AI powered digital technologies, right, is really accelerating force in the revolution. We like it or not, we have to actually leverage on it, embrace it to remain, relevant as and also succeed in this new world. And finally, I think that there should be with this COVID-19, where things have changed very rapidly. I talked about how things we expected to be done in 2 years now happening in just 2 months. I think there is even as we have to have this sense of urgency in terms of driving digitization. And as I mentioned just now, the key challenge to most organizations is a change in mindset and a change in culture. And we at Microsoft, we see that AI as being amplifying human ingenuity and capabilities as part of to support the mission of to empower every person and every organization on the planet. And it's all about how we can democratize AI so that more people and more organizations can benefit from these really powerful technologies. With that, thank you very much.